Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and this is Chasing Legends. Welcome back to Chasing Legends. I'm Wayne Tuttle, your host once again. Summer's ending, fall's starting up in Arizona, which means it's in the 90s. So it's not necessarily what you consider full fall weather, but here we are. And we're heading to the Dutch Hunter Rendezvous, the 21st annual, November 14th, 15th, and 16th. No water there, so bring your own water, bring your own food and whatnot, but it's a free event. We'll have speakers all day Saturday, a hike that'll start around 7:30 in the morning out to Barks Canyon. Should be a wonderful weekend. We should have great weather, we're hoping. That being said and done, pick up a copy of Sunsets or catch it on Amazon Prime. Great film. Our good friend Clay Wurst in it. Greg Davis, Brian Lickman, Ron Feldman, Bob Shoes, Ken Eddy. Really nice film put together. Additionally, Jason Fritsch, who will be one of our main guest speakers. Cracking the Code of the Lost Dutchman. His book is on sale currently at the Lost Dutchman Museum, also known as the Superstition Mountain Museum, and I believe it's available at Goldfield Ghost Town. Also available on Amazon. So there you go. Plug in the book, plug in the DVD. Let's get on today's story. Now, today's story is a bit different. I was going to tell that story from Colorado, and it's a rabbit hole and a half of a story. And I was going through it and starting to put the pieces together so I'd know my little bullet points to tell my story through. And then I had a phone call with someone else, and we talked about something, and it kind of triggered another thing about all these guys that search for the Lost Dutchman that you never hear about, but you hear in passing. And they're almost anonymous. They just kind of disappear in the woodwork. And there's some that are almost reclusive to the point we don't even know who they were. We just sometimes know just some sort of ghostly presence that they had been out there. You know, who was that guy? And that brought up this individual. Now, I don't know what his name was. He was known by several names by different people. So he probably, everyone felt that that was not his name. He never really would try to give his name. He was known as Henry. He was known as, I think, Bill. He was also known as Bell and Hill, which could have been a last name. But several people had run into him. Now, when I first heard about him, it was after several conversations where people would be talking about various people, I started realizing, I think they're talking about the same guy, but they're getting the name wrong. So I would always say, well, you mean so-and-so. And they would be like, no, he called him, that was Hill. And then the next guy I'd be talking to, and he'd be like, no, it was Henry. I don't know what his last name was. And the next guy would be like, oh, no, his name was Bell. So I was kind of curious and started once in a while talking to people. And what it was is this individual was everyone agreed one thing. He could disappear in a crowd. 5'5", 5'6", thin. Older, somewhere between probably 50 and in the early 70s. He always wore a straw cowboy hat. He always wore a button-up shirt, long sleeve with the sleeves buttoned, a pair of jeans and a pair of boots. There was nothing about him distinctively in color. Didn't wear colorful shirts or nothing. There was nothing. If you walked by him, you would just glance over, see a person, and just move on. They said he had a little longish hair that was down to just about his collar, and he had a beard, which he kept neatly shaved. Very nice, soft-spoken, but there was nothing about him that would trigger you to say, oh, I remember that guy. Now, some people have better powers of observation, so most of them noticed after time they would run into him. Now, this was another key thing in this individual, we'll call Henry, is that he would just show up. And he'd be at places, but it was never really the same place. So someone would say, I ran into him at Cobb's. He was having breakfast. Another time he was getting coffee at a Circle K. Then I was in Mesa one time at a McDonald's, and he was sitting there eating a breakfast. And they said you would just run into him different places, different times, but there was no pattern. There was never an algorithm where you could say, the guy lived here or did this. The one thing they all agreed on is they would occasionally run into him in the mountains. Now, the importance of this is that he would be in the mountains, and they said he would always come out, and it was somewhere between Marsh Valley and Whiskey Springs, which is a large area, but they said it could have been Trap Canyon. He would just come out and show up on the trail. Sometimes he would just hit the trail and walk by you. You could say good morning, he'd say morning, and that was it. He never was rude. He didn't stop to make conversation. They said he would just walk by you, or a few occasions, he'd get on the trail ahead of you, and he would just continue down the trail. Now, a friend, someone I know, his name is Danny, and Danny had run into him. And Danny had kind of given him some rides and talked to him a few times. He ran into him one time, and he said he came out on the trail, probably from Trap Canyon or somewhere, but he said he just came out of the brush, ended up on the trail, going to Charlie Boy. And he was just kind of thinking that it was just kind of, he had a backpack, a sleeping bag, dressed the same as you would see him anyplace else, and just walking along. And Danny thought, well, I'm going to kind of keep up and kind of hang back, but I'm going to kind of watch where he goes, because he has to be going out or heading out, and I'm heading in, but this is kind of an odd route for him if he's leaving the mountains. So he followed for a while, and he said there was a couple switchbacks he was on, and he said as he hit one of these, comes out, you can see all the way down the trail, everything around him, and there is no one in sight. He said literally he had to have ducked off, very much like Ed Spook Buckwitz. But he said it was just like he was there, and then he just wasn't, and I paused, and then I kind of felt like, well, he must be watching me. And he said I didn't feel threatened, I just felt like he just didn't want anybody to know, or did he just cut off, head in a different direction? He said he had no clue. But he said he disappeared like a wisp in the wind. He was gone. So several people talked about how he would ask for rides. He would just, he'd be eating, and he'd look over at someone, and he'd say, come over and kind of make a brief introduction with one of his various names and say, I need a ride. Now, it could be to Mesa, downtown Phoenix, Scottsdale, downtown Tempe, but he would ask and say, hey, I could use a ride. I'm willing to pay for gas and so forth. I hate to trouble you, but would you be so kind? And a few people who'd seen him in the mountains were like, yeah, I got time. I'll give you a ride over there. And they all said the same thing, as you gave him a ride. You arrived at the destination. It was usually a cross street, and he'd just say, pull over here. He'd get out, put a $50 bill on the seat, say, thank you very much for your kindness, and he would just walk off. Everybody said it was hard to have conversation with him, because he really wouldn't answer. If you said, the weather's nice today, he'd say, yeah, the weather's real nice. So how you been doing? Fine. And they said he just never really would elaborate, go into conversation. So no one had a clue. Now, when you dropped him off, you need a ride back or something? No, I'm good. I'll see you around. And off he went. And they said it was very odd, because a few days later, a week later, you just run into him. And they talked that, you could be in Mesa at a McDonald's, he's sitting there eating breakfast. The next time you see him, you could be at a Starbucks, he's just in line getting a cup of coffee in Tempe. So he was getting around and doing things, but he didn't seem to drive, do, or have a residence. He was always neatly dressed, seemed to be fine. So Danny said he takes him one trip, and he said he was just towards the end of where he'd been seeing him. And he said he asked for a ride. He said, yeah, sure, let me finish my meal. He said he finished up his eating, and when he was ready to go, he went out front. Henry's waiting for him patiently. They get in the car, they're going, and on the way, Henry just reached over and said, would you mind stopping someplace briefly for me on the way? And he handed him, looked like a business card, but it was a business card that had like block lettering of an address. And he looked at it and said, yeah, I think I can find that place. He said, it'll just be a few minutes. I need to stop there on the way. So they pulled up. Very nice house in Scottsdale, an old Scottsdale. He said they pulled up. Henry gets out, goes up, rings the doorbell. Lady answers the door. He walks in the door. He says, 2-3 minutes go by. Henry comes out. He was empty-handed when he went in. Comes out with a manila envelope. Said Henry just walks out the door shuts behind him, he gets in the car, and they start driving away. He looks over, Henry opens the envelope and starts taking little stacks, banded stacks like from the bank of $100 bills, pulls up his pant leg, starts sticking them in the sides of his boot. And he said there was quite a number. There's probably 8 or 9 of these little packets. He said it had to be thousands and thousands of dollars. And he's like, hey, do you want to stop by a bank? We can stop by the bank and and you can deposit that. And he said, Henry just turned to him and said, I don't do banks. I've never used a bank in my life. No, I'm fine. And he said, well, that's a lot of money to carry around on you. And Henry didn't seem to have an answer for that or anything to qualify it. They got to their stop. He said, just like normal, you can pull over here. He said he got out. He watched him. He said, thanks for the ride. Put a $50 bill on the seat. And he just walks off down the street. So no one's quite sure what he was doing or how this was working, but Danny got bothered by it a bit, enough to go, your curiosity is, how do you survive? I see you eat. I know you get a cup of coffee. I see you walking down the street once in a while. Danny said you'd just be driving and you'd look over and he's just walking down the road. And he seemed fine, seemed in good health, seemed to be mentally there, aware, but you never had a conversation, so you weren't sure. But he said they were taking a ride and they were going downtown Phoenix. And he said he had time, so he turned to him and said, tried to make a little small talk. And said, so you never use a bank. I take it you live in Apache Junction. And Henry turned to him and said, no, I don't really live anywhere. And he's like, oh, well, where are you from? Because he realized he's getting conversation. Henry said, nowhere in particular. And he said, well, what brought you here? And Henry said, I prospect, and this seemed like a good place. I'd heard a lot of things, and it's done well by me. The mountains have treated me well, so I'm quite happy and all. And he kept approaching things, and Henry would just reply with a very a short answer, like was something of, oh, okay, blah, blah, blah. And then he would just be like, nope, don't have any use for that. Nope, I'm not a religious man, never have been. Don't know nothing about politics. Never cared to inquire much. Don't read the newspapers. And he just realized he was very well spoken, enunciated very well. He just got the idea that the individual just didn't care. You don't have a home or any place? I get by. And he realized you had to have showered. You had to have done it. Well, how do you get around? And well, I don't have a driver's license. I've never owned a car. I make do. And he kept waiting for Henry to get a little tired of it, and he didn't. And he said, so you kind of have been able to survive off your prospecting, which seems ridiculous. And he just looked at him and, yeah, pretty much so. Now, he said they got to their point where they were going to drop off and part ways. And he said, Henry didn't seem bothered by it at all. He was very happy he got some answers, even though they were not answers, because he didn't know a single thing about him, including his name, where he was from, if he had a place he lived, when he arrived, what he was doing, other than he prospected, which they all figured because he was in the mountains. And he pulled over. He had a tobacco bag. Pipe smokers will have their tobacco and their pipe in it and stuff. They're smaller than like the little bank bags. And he opened it up, unzipped it, and it was just full of cash. And Henry went to reach in and said, oh, and then took out a $100 bill and just left it and went to put a seat. And he said, I've given you plenty of rides. This one's on me, no problem. And Henry looked at him and said, you're way too kind. And he said, no. And Henry said, well, I'm sorry, because I don't like anything under a 50 or a 20. I don't take change. I just pay whatever rounds off above the bill. So he said, well, I'm sorry, I just don't have any. He said, no, we've taken plenty of drives. This one's on me. And Henry said, thank you very much, took the $100 bill, put it back in there. He said there had to be thousands and thousands of dollars in there. Zipped it up, stuck it in his jeans in the pocket where it's bulging, and he just, tipped his hat and walked away. Now, I talked to a couple of the people, not everyone could always remember, because people said the problem is he was a guy that nobody kind of knew. I talked to other people and they said they never heard of this guy. But the people that had met him said you could walk by him and you would sit down and then you'd look over and realize he's sitting there. You walked by him, he just disappeared in a crowd. Sometime around COVID, they said he just vanished. Now, they don't know if he went off, moved off somewhere else. Maybe he got COVID. Maybe he got sick. Maybe something else happened with him. But they said he didn't turn up anywhere. And they said he used to turn up once in a while. You would notice him in different places. He did get around quite a bit, but no one saw him in the mountains. No one saw him around Apache Junction. No one saw him around Mesa. So he just kind of vanished. I found the story very interesting. About 6-7 months ago, I was really looking at things like, well, what would you do in an obituary? Well, nobody knew who he was, and he didn't have ID. Could you survive in that? I started playing it in my head. Well, what could you do with someone that almost didn't exist? I have no idea. Now, Danny said one thing that was funny on the last drive they took. They were having this conversation, and he turned to him and said, what would ever happen if you were arrested? And he said, Henry looked at him and said, that would be very interesting for both them and myself. And so I took it as he literally doesn't exist. He somehow has managed in life to almost disappear into himself. And I realized if you have cash, you can almost get anything. You need a hotel room. If they want a card and you don't have a card, there is someone there that will take cash to reserve a room for you. You pay them cash and you got your room. You literally could do that if you had the financial ability. So it would take cash. But how did he survive? Somehow he survived. And it was probably through a bit of familiarity. Now, there has to be some places that traded in gold or certain things and people he dealt with had to know something more of him. But then at the same time, did they really? Was it just, he was the guy you knew. You could trust him. He'd just show up, cash, gold, whatever he was doing. So there's the story. I don't even know what we'll label it. Maybe we'll call it the story of Henry, story of Bell, story of Hill. Everyone I've talked to, nobody felt like he used his real name. And again, they had asked him his age, this, that, and different things. He seemed to not care about those things. None of it seemed to matter. So I would get a feeling that that individual, if he did know, it was deeply buried where no one would ever know. So here's hoping, though it's been probably 6 or 7 years since anybody's seen anything from Henry, that somebody would have seen him, that he's still out there, that he's doing well. Because he sounded like a really nice guy. And he sounded like he could be an interesting guy. But then maybe he's not, right? Maybe he's that guy that goes out, prospects, does his thing, lives off of the cash, just a simple existence. And in that simple existence, there just really isn't anything else to push. There's no spiritual discourse. There's no politics. There's nothing beyond. It's a nice day out. So to you, Henry, wherever you may be, hopefully you're doing well. And if not, well, hopefully you had a good life, and it sounds like you just simply lived the life you wanted to, which I think we all wish we could. There you are. I don't know if it's an uplifting story. It has a little bit of a sad ending because we don't really know what happened to him. And if someone shares or knows something or knew Henry Bell Hill, or by the description, which again could be anybody, kind of knows they gave this guy a ride, he dropped a $50 bill on this. Maybe we'll get a couple more stories out of this and kind of know a little bit of who he was, what made him tick a little. But you kind of almost envy him. Just the non-possession guy with cash who just lives day to day in the present and probably is very much at peace with himself then and always. So there you go, Chasing Legends this week. Please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. Leave us comments. Check out the website at legendofthesuperstitionmountains.com. Rendezvous November 14th, 15th, 16th, and we're closing in. It's time for October coming up. We get to tell those 3 or 4 spooky stories before we hit November and build into things. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for hitting us with the lives. Hope everyone has a great rest of the week, but always remember, I'm Wayne Tuttle. You're not. And this was Chasing Legends.